Good evening, everyone. Hi. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Tutor Panel, A Monument Without a Tomb, the finale of Shakespeare Week. I want to extend a special welcome to the admitted students and their families. I'm Sarah Davis, I'm the Dean of the college. I'll have the chance to talk to you tomorrow morning. But for now, we are just so pleased to have you here with us this weekend. I hope you guys all had the chance to attend some of the events this week that we held in celebration of the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's First Folio. For me, the Wednesday performances of the scenes that will be discussed this evening were a real high point, as was the Prometheus Club and Miss Vila's Fry Bread at the Elizabethan Market. I want to thank everybody who helped to make that happen. In particular, I want to thank Alison Chapman, who put so much energy into bringing this idea to life. It may become an annual thing, just to warn you. Okay, so the First Folio was published 7 years after Shakespeare's death in 1623 by his friends and colleagues. It contains some of Shakespeare's most famous plays, comedies, tragedies, and histories. Many of these plays had never been published and would have been lost had this compilation not been put together. My thinking about this week, prompted in part by Ms. Chapman, a conversation we had, was that in addition to this week's activities celebrating this 400th anniversary of the Folio, it's been an opportunity for us to engage actively with a question that follows us through the program about the different ways in which words can land meaningfully with us. This week, we've engaged with Shakespeare's words in written texts as readers, in performances as audience members, or for the actors as performers, in seminars through conversation, and tonight in this panel as speakers and listeners. We read Plato's Phaedrus in the freshman year and again as the very last reading of the senior year. It bookends the program. In it, we are led to wonder about our relationship to words and the ways in which they come alive for us, what it means for words to come alive, to be, in a sense, ensouled. Shakespeare's work, described in the preface of the First Folio by Ben Jonson as a, quote, monument without a tomb, not of an age but for all time, is a wonderful occasion for us to renew this question for ourselves. So at that, I'm going to hand it over to the tutors. Following the order the plays appear in the folio, I hope this is right, Mr. Smith will speak on As You Like It, followed by Ms. Barrett on Hamlet, and then Mr. Venkatesh will speak on Hamlet and the folio itself, and then finally we'll conclude with Ms. Chapman on King Lear. One final word. After the panel, there'll be a reception, and I was told that there are pizzas left over from another event. Feel free to eat the pizzas. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. I hope you enjoy this because I'm followed by Hamlet, King Lear. So, right. I am going to talk about As You Like It, one of my favorite Shakespearean comedies, and in particular the beginning, especially Scene 2 of Act 1, which was performed earlier this week. I've always been struck by the fact that As You Like It has a very dark beginning. A beginning so dark and twisted that a reader or spectator of the play could well expect a tragedy of the first order to follow. The play begins with brother hatred, the primal conflict between the elder and younger brother. The elder brother has been by social conventions concerning birth order favored by fortune, while the younger brother appears to be favored by nature. The echo of Cain and Abel is called forth as the dead father's loyal servant Adam comes onto the scene, and we witness the almost deadly wrestling of the two brothers. This dark and primordial conflict of brothers is further dramatized by the overthrow of Duke Sr. by his younger brother, with Duke Sr. fleeing into the forest of Arden. Furthermore, The usurping younger Duke's daughter Celia and her cousin Rosalind, who is the daughter of Duke Sr., are caught up and totally entwined in a plot that is knotted with murderous threats and whispers of poisoning and the plotting of murder under the displays of wrestling for the court. The usurping Duke comes to banish Rosalind in fear that she is so favored by nature as to outshine his own daughter, Celia. From this beginning comes the question of how, out of such a dark and ominous beginning, instead of a tragic play that ends in a fecundity of death, we have this play that ends in a pastoral plethora of marriages, even granted that some of the couplings are on the strange side, and further complicated by the fact that some characters refuse to come back into the social fold. The opening up of a space for what I am going to call affirmative comedy, both as to tone and to thematic elements, begins early. This opening begins with various wrestlings, but with wrestlings of words and speeches rather than wrestling for property, position, wealth, and power. At the beginning of Scene 2, Act 1, we see Celia admonishing Rosalind to be merry, in what I take to be a Chaucerian manner. Celia couples this admonishment with a declaration to Rosalind of her genuine affection for her. It is here, at the beginning of Celia's and Rosalind's interaction, that we see how important genuine affection is for the opening of this comedic space. The genuine affection between Rosalind and Celia stands in stark contrast to the two brother pairs we have seen. This affection is the foundation that provides the possibility for love to develop. The loves that may develop from this affection differ in kind, though, differ in kind in that these loves are more involve the intertwining and knotting of the two lovers as they become more and more knitted together. However, the emotions that can come forward from such entanglements can be and often are dark, the dark emotions of jealousy, envy, suspicion, revenge, etc., and can contribute to events taking a tragic course. There are even some hints at this possibility for Celia and Rosalind. We hear their relationship described as one of more than sisterly affection, and we hear Celia's concern that she, Celia, loves Rosalind more than Rosalind loves her. These two are incredibly close, especially from Cecilia's side, as shown by her coming to voluntarily share Rosalind's banishment. However, Celia never allows her love for Rosalind to overwrite and undercut the genuine affection the two young women share with each other. We can see this in the fact that Celia does not display any jealousy as Rosalind falls in love and proceeds to instruct Orlando on how to woo and on how to be a proper lover. Remarkably, it is Celia at the end of Act 1 who reconceptualizes their banishment into a journey, an adventure into liberty. This recasting gesture of going to liberty critically keeps the comedic space open and allows the play to continue playfully in this space. Celia's preservation of their genuine affection, even in the context of a more than sisterly love, provides a protection from the darker emotions that often emerge from a more intertwined love. This preservation makes possible the opening of this comedic space and also provides a bulwark against those tragedy-promoting emotions of jealousy, suspicion, and mistrust. On the analogy with what Aristotle observes in his Ethics, namely that virtue friendship is the only proof against slander. As I reflected on the beginning of the play and upon the opening of this affirming comedic space, my admiration for Celia and my appreciation for the quality of her wit and her affection for Rosalind grew. It is within Cecilia's admonition to be merry and her affirmation of their affection that we hear Rosalind's response. Quote, From henceforth I will be merry, coz, and devise sports. Let me see, what think you of falling in love? Sport or game is central to being merry and carries with it its own tone and requirements. Celia recognizes what is required to keep a situation sporting and playful as she responds, quote, "Marry, I pray thee do, to make sport withal, but love no man in good earnest, nor no further in sport, neither than with safety of a pure blush that mayest in honor come off again." The narrow path here involves questions as regards preserving and protecting such a comedic space while undertaking an exploration of new beginnings that often involve falling in love. How to have the room to make such sport, given the dark and ominous circumstances the two young women find themselves in, and how to find the new beginnings that affirming comedies calls for, while recognizing all the complexities and dangers such new beginnings bring, that is indeed a narrow path. It is Celia who begins to open this space for merriment by mocking the good housewife Fortune's distribution of gifts. This mocking distances the two young women from the situation they find themselves in and allows them to look at the situation more generally and more reflectively and more critically. This mocking is soon extended to include nature and the distribution of her gifts as well. The tension within the distribution of fortune gifts, as well as the tension between the distribution of fortune and the distribution of nature, provides the context for this banter, this verbal wrestling, with the claim that banter on this topic in particular sharpens the wit. It is within Cecilia's admonishment to be merry and the banter on fortune and nature that has provided some respite from the immediate and ominous darkness of their circumstances that allows, even encourages Rosalind to say, "Let us make sport of falling in love," and playfully to act on such. This verbal play and wrestling with fortune and nature serves to not only lighten the mood, but also serves to enlighten the two so that they can live within the situation while undertaking the sport of falling in love. It is here that wrestling as a sport with its own rules and dynamics comes to the fore. We have seen the wrestlings of the brothers and have heard of the power wrest from Duke Sr. We are also aware of a previous wrestling performance of the court wrestler and the dangerous plan of Orlando to wrestle the court wrestler the next day, and of Oliver's counter plan. Wrestling becomes here not only an apt description of several struggles for power and the medium for plots of murder, but also as the offer of entertainment suitable for young ladies. It is at this point, with the conjunction of all these factors, that wrestling as a sport comes to function as a kind of conceit. A conceit like the conceits that Shakespeare uses in several of his sonnets. A conceit has an etymological connection to concept and to the intellectual realm. A conceit is a metaphor or simile, but one that provides a framework through which one can see and think about what the sonnet is exploring and expressing. This framework appeals to the mind rather than the sentiments and uses the inherent relations and workings of the conceit, in this case, the sport of wrestling, to map the subject matter. We see this use of this conceit when Rosalind meets Orlando after his wrestling victory. She expresses and sees her initial attraction to and falling in love with Orlando through this conceit as being overthrown. Being overthrown in a wrestling match is not unexpected, nor the end of the world, but part of the sport of wrestling. Orlando, too, describes his attraction to Rosalind as his being overthrown. As seen and experienced within the conceit of wrestling as a sport, the contestants can be serious without being deadly serious or tragically fated. When Rosalind talks of being overthrown, in effect wrestling with and being put in a hold by Orlando, by the feelings he has provoked, two things are seen. First, Something different in tone has occurred in their gloomy situation in the spirit of sport. And secondly, the wrestling talk allows Rosalind to gain some distance, not only from her current situation, but from the feelings that have emerged from her encounter with Orlando. Wrestling with the relative influences and roles of nature and fortune has allowed this. It is through this sharpening of their wit, especially as concerns nature and fortune, that these two young women can take hold of each other and their situation without simply and immediately fantasizing themselves out of their current dilemmas. Within this comedic space, with her sharpened wit and with the use of wrestling conceit, Rosalind can wrestle with the distributions of fortune and nature. She can perform stage magic that helps others find new beginnings, as well as save herself and Orlando from a love that would simply settle for either at first a mute beginning and then an amateurish poetical expression of love that she at first receives from Orlando. Finally, I think the use of the sport of wrestling as a conceit not only helps to open up this comedic affirming space, but also retrospectively casts light on the dark beginnings, bringing to light possibilities and dimensions not initially seen. That is, helping us in retrospect to see the attractions and affections that may lie beneath the dark, dangerous wrestlings that begin the play. This change of tone that opens up a space for affirmative comedy within and after a dark beginning is not possible without the existence of genuine affection. Any successful playing with the distributions of nature and fortune must be undergirded by such relations. We see such affections between Rosalind and Celia, Adam and Orlando, and later on in the abundance of goodwill as expressed by Duke Sr. in Exile. It is this genuine affection that is proof against a sharpened wit turning corrosive and destructive, or less seriously, lapsing into indifference. The gap between appearance and reality that is crystallized by such wit cannot be defended against suspicion and mistrust, and cannot carry out its task comedically and affirmatively without the presence of genuine affection. Thank you.
Good evening. I am going to assail your ears with an unfolding of Act 1 of Hamlet. Everyone notices that Hamlet is sometimes ironic, even Polonius. Yet the prince is hardly exceptional in this respect. Indeed, irony looks more like his most common talent. Double talk virtually plagues Elsinore. Polonius speaks in triple puns, Claudius lies, Gertrude is to the point, except when she is not. Ophelia plays at piety and vulgarity, although neither by choice. Horatio gives historical accounts that do not add up. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern forswear their ruse before they forswear their faith. Laertes, who is first advised, "To thine own self be true, thou canst not then be false to any man," ends by intriguing against his fellow man. Everyone says other than they mean. We can be sure neither of what they mean, nor that each knows what they say. Case in point. Polonius loses his thread, but is wise to Hamlet's method. Claudius never tells a bold-faced lie. Gertrude might be more forgetful than duplicitous. Ophelia less innocent than inconstant. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern could remain faithful and ignorant. Laertes does confess himself, but only when the deed is done and he is dying, so perhaps he is playing God false instead of man. And in a world that features a ghost, an immortal death, why not an immortal life? After all, Horatio says he is more Roman than Dane. Perhaps he speaks the truth. To further complicate matters, Denmark itself seems to share in this epidemic opacity. Disorientation abounds, and explanations for the disorientation dominate. The Denmark of Hamlet is clearly in transition, showing signs of Catholicism mixed with doubt. So we get purgatory plus Wittenberg, birthplace of the Reformation and hometown to the infamous Dr. Faust, a name synonymous with the birth of the Enlightenment. And even though we never leave Elsinore, everyone else does. Hamlet and Horatio arrive from Germany. Laertes embarks for France. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern come from abroad and are sent away. The acting troupe is traveling. So there's an international sensibility being imported into a closed community in a casual way. These issues are further reflected in the characters' names. We have Latin, Greek, French, Italian, German, and only a smattering of Scandinavian or Norse. Moreover, the opening scene, the first two names we hear are Bernardo and Francisco, which are Italianate. The second two are Latin, Horatio and Marcellus. It is only at line 15 when Marcellus says, liegeman to the Dane, that we have any idea where and when we are. And even then, we might well be confused why the Danish king does not seem to have any Danish liegemen. Now, none of this is irrelevant because Denmark's standing is under threat, which is the explicit topic of the first scene. When Horatio takes the appearance of the ghost to bode some strange eruption to our state, Marcellus takes him to mean the disruptive preparations that bespeak impending war. The ghost is not the only unexplained disturbance, and so the guard makes an apparently obvious connection. Whatever gave rise to the supernatural occurrence must likewise be behind the unusual activity, the strict guard, the untimely labor of subjects, trade for weapons, conscripted ships. Not one of these is as strange as the sighting of a ghost. What is strange, however, is a guard who has to ask why he is standing guard when such preparations are already underway. Apparently, we are watching a cohort of men who do not know what they are doing. They are going through the formal act of standing guard, but they seem neither sure about the status of the threat nor concerned with the status of what they are protecting. Claudius is never mentioned. Horatio alone uses personal pronouns to refer to Denmark and her subjects. Which leads us to notice a second strange aspect of their behavior. We wonder why they take the ghost as a portent of Denmark's struggle with Norway, and not as indicative of any struggle within Denmark's own ruling class. This is slightly remarkable since Denmark has just undergone a huge shift in authority. A lot of preparations, plus the sighting of a dead king, might more obviously relate to such a transition. So then why do they assume the ghost has something to do with Fortinbras and not Claudius? Horatius' appeal to Julius Caesar imagery only highlights the weirdness. Caesar was killed by conspiracy because of a changing political order and inaugurated the issue of succession in Rome, all of which points to Denmark's hybrid political structure and the obvious question, why is Claudius king and not Hamlet? So at first, if a monarchy is hereditary, it makes no sense to kill your brother for the crown. But then it turns out that Denmark is one of Machiavelli's elusive elective monarchies. Yet this doesn't solve the problem, since killing Hamlet still wouldn't guarantee Claudius' advancement. Not only that, if Claudius knows enough to hope to hold on to the crown, he must know about Fortinbras' threat. Weakening Denmark at such a critical moment could easily make her the victim of her enemies. So the guard's assumption about the ghost elides two political mysteries that frame the action of the play before it even begins. First, an international instability, where a young prince is reasserting his right to lands lost by his father. We have no idea what lands they are. Do they include Elsinore? Fortinbras will imply as much. Or what the terms of their surrender were. Second, an internal instability, where a young prince is not asserting his right to a throne lost by his father. Yet we do not understand Hamlet's indifference any more than Fortinbras' insistence. Their situations are mirrors of one another, where Fortinbras' schemes are born of thinking the state disjoint and out of frame. Hamlet's schemes are born to set right a time out of joint. But with this crucial difference, one is political and external, the other familial and internal. Old Fortinbras lost his land, perhaps stolen, and his kingdom passed to his brother, the uncle whom Claudius will call upon to reign in young Fortinbras, the son who is attempting to exact political vengeance upon the usurper. Old Hamlet lost his throne, likely stolen, and his kingdom passed to his brother, and his ghost, if it is his ghost, demands his son exact vengeance, which turns out to have terrible political consequences. Moreover, these two problems are linked because the very identity of Denmark is at stake in both, and therefore at stake in a double way. The fact that Shakespeare takes care to people Elsinore with characters named from everywhere and every time highlights the compound issue. What exactly is Denmark? What is this country that old Hamlet and Fortinbras fought over, Claudius killed for, Hamlet is alienated from, Fortinbras is invading, Horatio loves without knowing, Laertes abandons without caring, and which is being guarded by a sentry who does not even know what he is guarding her against? In the first scene, Horatio refers to the king as buried Denmark, and the ghost as like the king. But what would buried Denmark look like exactly? Perhaps a band of men standing guard in the dead of night who cannot see, who do not recognize one another, who never name themselves and don't know what they're doing, where time stands so still that one who witnessed distant history but is only privy to rumors about current events is nonetheless the best authority on the activity of the land. In his first soliloquy, Hamlet compares his father to Hyperion, the sun god. The sun has been killed. Darkness and confusion have fallen over the land. Something is rotten. So we have a confluence of political and religious instability and a tally of references, allusions, and names combined in various ways to give us a Roman, a Christian, and a humanist sensibility. Now we might understand this lineage as a historical progression, except that Hamlet, the character, and Hamlet, the play, mix them up so that altogether they comprise a sort of indeterminate dyad between the timely and the timeless, or the relative and the absolute, which shows up twice more over the course of the first act as two different takes on the untimely death of the late king. First in Hamlet's relationship to Claudius, so the political, then to the ghost, so the religious. With Claudius, this disjunction turns into convention versus nature, which he tries to collapse and Hamlet insists on preserving. We get a conventional father seeking to replace his natural predecessor and a natural mother urging the naturalness of the replacement. The issue here is generation and succession. With the ghost, the distinction will turn into nature versus the supernatural, hence filial remembrance as immortal duty. When we put the two together, we notice that nature shows up on both sides of the disparity, but it is subsumed by its converse. So opposite convention, nature will appear timeless, and opposite the supernatural, timely. Yet what is consistent is that it never appears at all except by virtue of relating to one or the other. And Hamlet, given his position, personifies this cross-section. He is nature to Claudius's perverted kingship and the ghost's perverted Catholicism, and thereby introduces the question, what kind of being is it for whom there are such divergent but equally unnatural claims, but whose nature only seems to show up when this unnaturalness becomes evident? These are really the stakes in Hamlet's first speech, although here they are again translated, this time, into the particular versus the common, which manifests as a problem in translating being into appearance or moving from the inside outside. One might say the darkness of the world is dawning on Hamlet. Thus, the opacity that has been the implicit issue all along is Hamlet's explicit focus, both in form and content. The first 3 times he speaks, he puns, and his first speech at any length insists that he is not what he seems. He says, "Seems, madam, nay it is, I know not seems. 'Tis not alone my inky cloak, good mother, not customary suits of solemn black, nor windy suspirations of forced breath, no, nor the fruitful river in the eye, nor the dejected haviour of the visage, together with all forms, moods, shapes of grief, that can denote me truly. These indeed seem, for they are actions that a man might play, but I have that within which passes show, these but the trappings and the suits of woe." First, what would it mean to know seems? If you are the being who seems and you do not know seems, can you know what you are? Hamlet makes this claim in response to Gertrude as a sign of his particularity, that he is not common. He's just punned on the word. So he says, it does not seem particular to him that his father has died. It is particular. And yet his assertion implies that the only way we know there is something within which passes show is as a failure to show whatever it is. Hamlet must indicate it negatively. If he could capture it, it would seem, which means that you only show up in the world in a common way, in a way that someone else could fake and therefore is not particular to you. And only insofar as this common trait fails to capture the particularity of you, do you even know there is a particular you. In which case, you cannot get at that within which passes show, except through a litany of things that do show. But conversely, can you get at seems without understanding it in relationship to what does not seem? Only poetically, which actually means no. I was not expecting that to be a laugh line. So the question becomes, what is the common image for this peculiar being who both is and is not what he seems? Perhaps madness. Hence, one formula for the central problem of this play. Is Hamlet mad, or is he play acting? Can you do one without becoming the other? Because on the one hand, this makes madness the sign of awareness, but on the other, it makes awareness indistinguishable from irrationality and therefore from lack of awareness, all of which just spells out the paradox of self-knowledge. If you appear as you are, you cease to be yourself. If you never appear, you cannot know yourself. The instability of Denmark is fast beginning to look like the personification of the far more radical instability of man's own impenetrability to himself. Thus, Hamlet's prelection, while aware of the problem, does not actually solve the problem. Rather, his claim about seems performs in speech his criticism of action. We don't know precisely what he means. Is he suggesting that he is unable to display himself because it is impossible to make the self seem? Or that it is impossible to see the self because everyone assumes the self seems? This is to ask, does the seeming belong to the actor or the spectator, which amounts to privileging the subject, being, or the verb, deed. If we consider deed, then in a plot scaffolded by huge and transgressive actions, we have a main character whose main action until the last act is play acting, and whose first speech is that his actions cannot reveal him, which tacitly proposes that play acting is the truth of all acting. That is, it is self-aware acting, acting that knows itself as distinct from the being performing the act, and therefore more truthful. Hamlet will repeatedly use stage lingo, and at various points plays the writer, actor, spectator, director, critic. If the focus is being, however, and it's impossible for a man to show himself for what he is, then our question is, can a man become as he appears? So flip it. If you want to display the nature of the being who can never display his nature, is the display of this failure the most honest display available to you? Thus, Hamlet's transparency shows up as an insistence on appearing other than he is in a way which reveals that he is other than he appears. That everyone distrusts him is the sign of his authenticity. His verbal acrobatics, not the appearance of the ghost, is what sets Elsinore on edge. Now, there is a suggestive reciprocity between Hamlet's first speech, which tries to bring the inside out, and the structure of Hamlet's first act, which moves from the outside in. We go from the castle's gate to a throne room to a private room at the same time that we go from international to national to familial concerns, before turning to the ghost, who is pure spirit, so a naked inside, but shows up in full armor, not quite a naked outside. One might say the ghost denudes the problem of the first act. Accordingly, his figure and his tale amplify the stakes in Hamlet's speech. In the ghost of the king, we have a strict divide between a life of action and a death that speaks, which is just another manifestation of the theme haunting the play thus far, although ironically, the poetic phantom makes it a material reality. His figure thus bears no visible sign of his foul and unnatural murder, but he must resort to words which are as questionable in his mouth as in the mouth of any living man. His story is that Denmark has mistaken a metaphor for the literal truth. The serpent that killed the king was no incidental serpent, but a man, his brother, and now a king. And yet the effect of the fatal poison is a skin erosion that could not possibly be confused with the look of natural death. If the ghost is telling the truth, he is not telling the literal truth, otherwise the general ignorance of both Hamlet and Denmark is inexplicable. He also speaks without perspective, narrating Claudius's approach and the internal course of the poison. And while an otherworldly spirit might be able to be both inside and outside of what he relates, the Father is trapped within and the Son is closed out. The imagery employed reproduces this ambiguity. It would have been familiar to the heirs of a Christian tradition. but is changed in two fundamental ways. First, the ghost combines man's fall from grace with the first murder. Original sin here is not eating of the tree of knowledge, but fratricide. Second, given that the skin erosion is rather like the scales of a snake, the serpent becomes the king and the king the serpent. King Hamlet is made to look as Claudius is, and Claudius as King Hamlet was, at least insofar as an office is able. And it really is able in this play. Claudius is named once in the stage directions, otherwise he's called king. The consequence of these parallel inversions is that the sinned against becomes the sinner, and the sin a sin of action, not of knowledge. So the ghost never asks Hamlet to kill Claudius. If he had, Hamlet would at least know what was necessary to satisfy the image of his father. As it stands, however, he could not know less than he does, but he must nonetheless act. Thus, Act 1 sets the stage, which is really our world staged, that is, framed. Because on the one hand, you never quite get to the world, but are always stuck in the poetic speech. But on the other hand, you can't speak without making an appeal to the world. Even to insist upon total subjectivity is to make an objective claim. So there is no way to be a realist, and there is no way to be a relativist. You are always in between. But then does this mean that the question is the best portrait of reality? A real question, one that can't be asked without seriously seeking an answer, so it cannot be faked, but nonetheless can't be answered. Because a real question can never be satisfied with itself. There's the rub. Asking fake questions are just answers in disguise. They are posers. But a real question is by virtue of striving to be something else, an answer. Now, poetry is by virtue of striving to be something else, the world. And the world is only that which it is for man. We do not get the world without us in it, and therefore we can never get an unpoetic world. So man is the thing that frames, and this becomes most important when he turns the frame upon himself. Thus, the soliloquy. Hamlet is attempting to frame his capacity to frame. Every single one of his soliloquies deals with death. There is a connection being made between knowledge of mortality and consciousness, or death and poetry. Why do these things go together? Hamlet's musings about death make it clear that he is no more able to kill himself than he is able to kill Claudius. Now, he never makes the direct connection, but it does seem, on the one hand, that the same thing which is stopping him from killing Claudius, that he does not know enough, is what stops him from killing himself. And on the other hand, the state of ignorance is so painful that it is what makes him want to kill himself. So the question becomes, given your state of ignorance, do you still know enough to know that you have to act despite your ignorance? And the starkest context in which to pose this question is revenge killing. This is the situation, maybe the only situation in life, in which a man acts like a god. He takes away life. Both a man and a woman are needed to create life, as is a huge amount of fortune, which remains true despite scientific advancement, but a man alone can kill. It is the autonomous action insofar as autonomy is possible. So this is where the question feels most painfully its own status as a failure to be an answer. Because to kill is to finalize a life. We don't know what we are once dead, but we do know we are not alive. Death cannot be a pun. It cannot not mean itself, whatever that is. The problem, then, is that death has all the absolutism of realism and all the contingency of relativism, because it really is final, and it really is unknown. So you really cannot kill ironically, and yet you really cannot know what you are doing when you kill. Oddly, man's most autonomous action is his most unknown. And such absolutely uncompromising ignorance about death is really the most extreme case, and thus the revelation of man's ignorance about himself. So the greatest act that a man can commit by himself, he cannot commit with knowledge, because he does not know what it means that he can commit it. He does not know what it means that he is mortal, that he can or cannot be. That is the question Hamlet would have to answer in order to act. He has to know what a man is to act like a man, or in order to be a man, he has to be a god. Of course, not knowing what he is exactly what a man is. And the act of such a being, i.e. the activity of being a being that does not know its being, is to talk to oneself. So the soliloquy is the autonomous human act as human and not as divine. It is a man alone, posing a question. So the two autonomous acts, killing and soliloquizing, conscience as morality and conscience as awareness, which is how the issue will get framed in Act 3. One privileges realism because it does make a definitive claim to a kind of finality and therefore an answer, and the other relativism because it is dependent upon uncertainty and hence the motive to talk to oneself. Thus, Hamlet holds up the two poles of limit cases of human autonomy as inverses of each other, reflection and action, talking to oneself, and acting with reflection, justified killing, all of which is packed into the opening lines of the play. Who's there? This is the question of Hamlet. Nay, answer me, stand and unfold yourself. This is the impossible demand of Hamlet, to make the inside outside. Neither character answers the question. They presume upon the basis of recognition the identity of the other. So they act as if they know, but they never do. Who's there is always the first question, and it is a question without an answer. The play Hamlet is the violent consequence of our inability to answer this question. Thank you.
Yikes, I have to follow those two. So my talk is going to be a lot rougher. It's in the nature of a sketch of a couple of readings. So you're going to find it light relief in the middle of these. Right, so did everyone get a handout? Or can everyone see a handout? So what I'm actually going to talk about is about 5 lines from Act 5, Scene 2. And I'm going to start from a point of detail, and then I'll spin out into some bigger questions that I'll leave as questions. I haven't, this is something I need to work out for a longer reading or for a longer lecture, but I haven't worked it out. So I'm going to sketch like where this might go. And, then I'm going to go back to a point of detail. Now the first page of the handout is from the Arden edition of Hamlet. And it's at the moment when it's before the fencing bout, and it's before the king and entourage are going to come in. And Hamlet and Horatio are alone. And Hamlet has just confessed that he's going to do it, but he feels sick at heart about something. And Horatio says, well, if you want me to, I can go and tell them to postpone. And Hamlet then says, in this edition, not a whit. We defy augury. There is special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all, since no man of aught he leaves knows what is to leave betimes. Let be. Right? Now, I'm sorry for the very opaque photocopy. I had no idea it would come up like this. But I wanted to look at, if I can see, hang on. Okay, right at the bottom of the page. So for those of you who have never done this, in a scholarly edition of Shakespeare, you're going to find the text, you're going to find commentary notes that gloss what's being said, that would give you linguistic commentaries, sometimes grammatical explanations, sometimes historical explanations of context, right? And then at the bottom of that, you're going to find textual notes. So this is in a way a small introduction to how to look at textual notes. So if you look at the bottom of the page, and you look at, let's see, 201, on the first line of the tiny print, the tiny, extremely gray print, right? It says 201 of ... knows, and then parenthesis, of aught he leaves knows, and then has aught of what he leaves, F, right? F means First Folio, right? So we're going to go to the First Folio in a minute. Owes aught of what he leaves, Hanmer, that's early 18th century editor. Knows aught of what he leaves. Knows aught of what he leaves. Jonson, that's Samuel Johnson, mid-18th century editor, and so on. So you see the different textual possibilities. So a responsible editor will tell you where his reading of the text is coming from. And so you look at the scholarly notes and you'll see where there are substantive disagreements about what the text says at that point. And so so that editor will pinpoint who was the first to say that, right? And so this is what the textual notes do. You'll find the same with Greek texts, for example. You should find the textual apparatus is what it's called. And this is part of what editors do when they make the book for you. And a lot of scholarly work goes in that producing this text. In fact, I think people in a great books college ought to know more about how the book comes to your desk. And not take it for granted as a physical object. It's actually very interesting. Okay, now, so since we're focused on the celebration of the First Folio, you want to think what does this Arden edition get from the First Folio? So if you turn the page, the page that says F1, 1623, it's First Folio, and here's the First Folio page. And the First Folio, this is a large book, right? People who complain that their Riverside Shakespeares are large, you have no idea. First Folio is about 3 times the size. I mean, it's not only a coffee table book, it could actually be a coffee table, right? And so it's gigantic. And the folio page is big. So you have a page about like this big, and what a folio is that it's folded once. Right, so that's a folio. A quarto is that it's folded again. So a folio is folded. You get 8 of these, and then they're sewn together, and that's called a quire, right? And with a folio, it's the same. When you get to 32 pages, you fold it 4 times. So that if you know anything about printing, this is one reason why there's so many divergences in the text, is that if I'm doing a folio, for example, if I'm setting the folio, so I put a metal frame and I pick from bins of type and I put them in the frame and I screw them tight, and I have this whole page, which for a folio will be 1, say if it's just 2 pages, 1 and 4, 2 and 3, right, on the other side. If I'm doing, if this is going to be 32 pages, a whole quire, this is going to be like 1 and 32, 2 and 29. 2 and 31, so I can't count today. So, and a quarto is much more complicated. So this act of setting a manuscript to print is a tremendously skilled act, because to do this, you've got to be able, as a compositor, you have to be able to judge, like where in the manuscript is, page 29 going to fall, and then kind of plan ahead for this. So this is often why the first editions of Shakespeare can be messy, because a lot depends on how good the manuscript is that they're working from, and sometimes how good the compositor is, the one who's setting the print. Sometimes also what other conditions are happening in the printing house. For example, if one of the editions of King Lear is printed in the midst of the Christmas rush, right? You think about all the sort of feast invitations and event announcements and theatrical brochures and news things that are printed at the same time from the same buckets of font, right, by the same 2 compositors. You can understand why there might be a rush job, or with Shakespeare plays, they run out of ease, right, and enter an exit. Very very common. You run out of ease, and so what do some compositors do? They paraphrase. Right, they find a way to say the same thing without ease. So this is. So this is one reason why you get these rush jobs. And so what an editor has to do, what a textual scholar has to do, is try to figure out by a whole lot of detailed detective work, like what is it they're working with? Is it a bad printing of a good manuscript? Right? Is it a faithful printing of a bad manuscript? Or what are you dealing with? What is this thing that you're dealing with? Okay, so if you look at the folio. So it's at the bottom of the page where the squiggles are on the left, there's a passage. Not a whit, comma, we defy augury. semicolon. There's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all, since no man has of what he leaves. So no man has aught of what he leaves. What is it to leave betimes? Since no man has aught of what he leaves, period. What is to leave betimes? What the hell does that mean? Right? Is this even good Elizabethan English? So then you find, okay, the First Folio, this is a problem. So we need to get this clear. What is Hamlet actually trying to say? Because this seems to be an important moment in his life. He can't suddenly descend into gibberish here. And so you say, well, do the other textual editions give a better idea? And so if you then turn the page, the first quarto, 1603, bottom of the page, no, Horatio, no, not I, sorry. And the back of the page in the original does show through, which is why this is a bad photocopy. This is excusably a bad photocopy, right? If danger be now, why then it is not to come. There's a predestinate providence on the page. In the fall of a sparrow, here comes the king. Right? Zero help. Right? So the first quarto is about half the length of the text of the second quarto and the First Folio. So it's known to be the bad quarto. Because some people say it's a text for theatrical production, or it's a text that people just remembered. So no one likes the first quarto very much. There's been some argument that it might have been a faithful representation of a good text, namely the text that Shakespeare had in mind at the time. Right? So a representation of Shakespeare's intentions at that time, and then his intentions changed. But very few people cleave to that. Okay, so first quarto, no help. Go to the second quarto, next page. So again, by the squiggles. Not a whit. We defy augury. There is special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all, since no man of aught he leaves knows what is to leave betimes. Let be. Okay, so this is obviously closer to the folio. And generally people think that the second quarto, nicknamed the good quarto, draws from the same manuscript as the folio draws from, or that the folio draws from the second quarto. Okay, so anyway, this is better, but again, it's not very helpful, since no man of aught he leaves knows what is to leave betimes. Betimes meaning so early, right? Let be. Okay, I'm going to come back to this sentence, but right now I'm thinking of that line. There's special providence in the fall of a sparrow, and my first kind of little sketch of a place to think about is that in Hamlet, in the latter half of Hamlet, you have a lot of implications or speeches that seem to express the role of providence in the events. Hamlet's escape from the pirate ship, this particular passage, even the finale, where everything just falls into place. The king is publicly unmasked as the murderer. The foil is in Hamlet's hand. Every moment comes together as if it's been planned by something. And the question that then would arise for me is, what kind of tragedy is this if it's suddenly taken a Christian turn? Can there be a Christian tragedy at all? So can there be a tragedy with a safety net of some larger order? And if it's not Christian, then what is it? There are writers who suggest that this sounds Taoist in some ways. When you surrender to the Tao, then when you give that kind of total surrender, then things will fall into place. You don't have to do anything. There's no agency. You just give yourself to the flow, and things will happen right. So this is, what kind of tragedy is that? Is that a tragedy anymore? If the last scene involves some kind of spiritual surrender, and who knows what afterwards, is there salvation in it? Maybe think about that. But this question about, okay, so maybe it's not a tragedy in a straightforward sense. And then I started thinking about Hamlet's place in Shakespeare's complete works, right? Hamlet doesn't go together with Macbeth and Lear and all those other tragedies. It's written way before. And so the chronology is something like this. It's Julius Caesar, 1599 or so, As You Like It, same year, Twelfth Night. Now, Twelfth Night is a play where things go seriously out of control, and it's a comedy with blood at the end. Then you get Hamlet, right? And then you get I try to read my notes. What is MW? So it's Merry Wives of Windsor, which is a potboiler, straightforward comedy. And then you have Troilus and Cressida. You have All's Well That Ends Well. You have Measure for Measure. So a whole bunch of plays that you call problem plays. Shakespeare's experimental period, where he's writing things that don't look like anything that's been written before in that genre. So he's coming up with the things that are very dark comedies. That As You Like It might suggest that way too. Very, very dark comedies where tragedy is just around the corner. Or you have All's Well That Ends Well, Measure for Measure, kind of joyless comedies. Troilus and Cressida, one where there's a lot of death at the end. And so you're thinking, well, okay, so what's he up to? He's experimenting. There's a lot of experimenting with genres, such that you might have, is it possible to have tragedies where everyone gets married at the end, or comedies where everyone dies at the end? Why not? So you can imagine like trying these things out, such that you're not really sure like what kind of play you're in right now, what kind of generic expectation. I'm thinking of Polonius's description of what the players can do: tragical, comical, historical, pastoral. Right? Scene individual or poem unlimited. Right? So when you think about like all the kinds of things that Hamlet can be, how it turns, every page it turns into something you don't expect it to be, and it can be very dark, and it can be uproarious funny in a turn, right? And it can be in a way like very spiritual and very crude, like in a turn. It's amazing. You don't know what's coming around the corner. So I'll throw this out to you to think about it. What kind of genre is Hamlet, and what would it mean if the genre is indeterminate? Right, so if it's not, okay, so Hamlet is uttering vaguely Christian sentiments here at the end. Now, and this goes back to Ms. Barrett's extremely helpful talk here, that I'm going to put it in my own kind of simple-minded terms, that in a way the whole of Hamlet is a play about bullshit, right? So bullshit being any speech that's not directed at the truth, and so Claudius bullshits, Polonius bullshits, and nearly everyone bullshits in some way. Now, bullshit isn't necessarily bad. We do this in seminar because you laugh because you know exactly what I'm talking about. But sometimes bullshit is instructive, because sometimes you say what you're not sure is true because you're trying something out. Right, because you're seeing how sometimes you're playing devil's advocate. You need to try things out. So you take a stab in the dark. You develop things that you don't believe, and then they all fall down, or you find you have to abandon them. So bullshit has positive uses, and so Hamlet is a play. Ms. Barrett's term for this is the pandemic opacity, which is a great term, but it's this all pervasive bullshit that the play begins with, And Hamlet is also a character who bullshits, so he bullshits himself, so the number of times when, like Polonius, like Claudius, language gets the better of him, so he starts speaking and he starts rolling in one direction, and then he pulls back and says, what the hell am I saying? I don't feel these things, right? And so he's constantly he goes off the rails, and then he catches himself. I think every soliloquy has a moment like that, where you're always wondering, like, what's he really trying to say? And he's not quite sure what he's really trying to say, but he's speaking around something or with something on the other side of the corner, right? That's always there, but he doesn't know, right? So in these Christian sentiments here, is Hamlet bullshitting again? In other words, that he says at any given point that he can say the things that seem good at the time, that feel a certain way, and then he'll pull back from it a couple of pages later. So is this right? Is he bullshitting? Is it another delusion that the end of the play will refute? In a way, the presence of death, all those corpses, the thing that you can't bullshit your way around, as Ms. Barrett is saying. What is impenetrable to bullshit? It's just there, right? What you make of it might be bullshit, but it's just there. You have all, in the grave digging scene, all you have is a scene with like lots of bones all over the place, and that's real, right? So this then makes me wonder about Hamlet as a character. He appears to me to be a character with no center. He's a person with no center, and I think, or at least a center that he's not sure about or can't find. And I think this is why the play gets performed to a startlingly different effect every year by powerful actors. And you go to watch Hamlet to see what the new Hamlet's going to be, because there doesn't seem to be a Hamlet, right? And every actor brings his own center to Hamlet. What does that mean then? So Hamlet might be an example of the modern man. I personally think that pagan man tends to know who he is better than modern man. With modern man, there's always something else he could be. And so Hamlet, the fantasist, has all these versions of himself in his own head. And perhaps we're left with an undecided Hamlet at the end. Now, so the man with no center, is that like a play with no center? All the things that don't make sense in the play, the things you can't square. That Miss Barrett gave a very good list. Why did X do this? Why did X do that? What do you make? How do you put together this behavior to this person and that behavior to that person? And there's no certainty, no conclusion. Even I keep changing my mind, once every 2 years about this. And so is it possibly a play without a center? That people who don't think it's a great play, they fault it on the basis of its incoherences, the narrative incoherences, the causal incoherences. But on the other hand, while you're watching Hamlet, you're completely mesmerized by the shimmering brilliance from moment to moment of this play. And the common feeling that you get, that most people get at the end of a performance of Hamlet, is, what the hell did I experience? What was that? I mean, you can try to articulate that later in words, but at the time, everyone is stunned. It happened, even though it's 3 hours long, it happened so quickly, and so much happened, and so much was said, and so many different things were said. You want to and it was all dazzling. So what was that? So you come out of the theater a little bit like Bottom on awakening from his dream. I had an experience, and no idea what that was. So. What happened? What was that? And I now go back to our first quotation. The readiness is all, since no man of aught he leaves knows what is to leave betimes. I don't find that very compelling, but some of your texts will have Samuel Johnson's version. No man knows aught of what he leaves. None of us knows anything about what we leave when we die. We didn't understand a thing that happened. We can get the bare bones of the narrative of our lives. We can pinpoint the things we said, the things we did. But does anyone understand why it all happened? How it all really happened? Right? And I think, so I think this is the experience that Hamlet leaves me with at the end in a kind of like very naive experience of the play. And Jonson's reading of this puzzling line of the folio, to me is the most satisfying. Is that if Hamlet comes to this realization at this point, and he says, none of us knows anything about what we leave behind when we die, so let's just do it. Let's do it, yeah. So, and it's more compelling, but is it still a Christian play? What kind of resignation is that? Is that a philosophic resignation? right? So those are my questions, and I'll leave with that. Thank you.
Okay. I'm our last speaker for the evening, so once I've finished, we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back in here for the question period, and we do hope you'll join us. Thank you. Okay. If Hamlet is, as we've heard, a play that is interested in our most recessive interiors, closets, consciousness, the mother's womb, King Lear might be best understood as a play obsessed by peripheries. Throughout the drama, we witness a preoccupation with the idea that it is at the remotest boundaries of a thing, or at the very furthest extremes of experience, where we encounter some kind of intelligibility or meaning. Thus, in his nadir of despair, King Lear calls upon a storm to singe his white head, as though that outermost membrane, that intense point of encounter between weather and skin, might provide assurance of the reality of the self, or of the world, or both. And when Edgar is first betrayed by his brother and father, he devises not merely to disguise himself, but to take on the very basest and poorest shape, revealing a deeper interest in discovering the unnamed something that can only be found by first reducing oneself to almost nothing. Over and over again, the play and the characters that populate it reach outwards in the hopes of making contact with something firm and final that will make understanding possible. It is in light of this preoccupation with boundaries that I want to turn to the cliff scene in King Lear, and more narrowly, to Edgar's image of the cliff itself. It comes at a moment in the play that is obviously engaged with extremes, both in terms of experience — Gloucester's blinding is one of the most violent acts that transpires on Shakespeare's stage — and in terms of topography, as Edgar is pretending to lead his father to the extreme verge of the cliffs of Dover on the outermost border of England. At first, it seems like the cliff's edge might provide precisely the kind of meaningful encounter that characters so often seek. As Edgar puts it, trifling with his father's despair may provide a way to cure it. Indeed, as Gloucester and Edgar approach this fictional boundary of the cliff, Gloucester notes that his unknown guide's voice is altered, such that he speaks in better phrase and matter than before, as though there is a clarifying eloquence that can only emerge when one arrives at the definitional edge of the world. And I quote, "Come on, sir, here's the place, stand still. How fearful and dizzy 'tis to cast one's eyes so low. The crows and choughs that wing the midway air show scarce so gross as beetles. Halfway down hangs one that gathers samphire, dreadful trade. Methinks he seems no beggar than his head. The fishermen that walk upon the beach appear like mice, and yond tall anchoring bark diminish to her cock a buoy almost too small for sight. The murmuring surge that on the unnumbered idle pebbles chafes cannot be heard so high. I'll look no more lest my brain turn and the deficient sight topple down headlong." At the same moment that Gloucester is apparently brought to the border of his country and the end of his life, Edgar paints a picture of a little world that is contiguous with the edge of the cliff, made up of fishermen and samphire gatherers who cling to the precipice to eke out a hard living. One could imagine the speech succeeding in this simple respect, of showing how the most exceptional states of suffering and the ordinary affairs of the everyday touch one another, as people who've experienced grief know they do. Such a reading would suggest that Edgar aims to put the isolation of psychic pain back in contact with a full and ongoing world, of offering to his father a way of returning to life. But that hope for the generative meaningfulness of liminal spaces is ultimately not satisfied by the image of the cliff. Instead, its formal boundary is represented as a place of chaotic and entropic forces and interactions. Edgar's speech, which begins with the promise of a world, ends with the ravages of a sea, a murmuring surge that chafes against unnumbered idle pebbles, reminding us that a cliff is produced through external forces that act with violence upon its surface. To the extent that a cliff has an interpretable nature, it is not of the Aristotelian teleological sort, but rather of the kind that we encounter in Darwin. Nature as an open-ended battlefield of competing forces, a thing that is created through history and chance. In Book 7 of the Poetics, Aristotle gives us his most complete definition of tragic form, arguing that tragedy is the mimesis of an action that is complete and whole. Particularly important is the idea that tragedy has a beginning that, quote, does not itself follow anything by causal necessity, but after which something naturally is or comes to be. Tragic form, therefore, must neither begin nor end at haphazard. For Aristotle, it is a kind of formal boundedness that distinguishes tragedy from the calamities of mere history. Unlike the work of the historian, who may find herself continuously seeking some prior explanatory cause, the tragedian knows when to stop pointing backwards. Without these formal boundaries, the suggestion seems to be that tragedy would not make moral sense. One might be tempted with the idea that everything could be simply reduced, diminished, explained away. It is only because of these clearly defined edges that even the most horrifying moments of human experience can be rendered intelligible and transformed into sources of inherent meaning. Aristotle's distinction bears significantly on King Lear, a play which was initially categorized as a history before being reassigned to the tragedies in the First Folio. While it would be a mistake to hang too much thinking on this classification puzzle as such, King Lear itself seems to be obsessed with investigating boundaries of meaning in precisely Aristotle's terms. In a way, it is where the play begins, as Lear himself effects a kind of mimesis not dissimilar from that of the tragic poet, attempting to translate the magnitude of his daughter's love to lines on a map, carving England into precisely expressive bounded sections, as though love is a thing that could also be thought of as having clearly defined formal edges. But as we see in the cliff scene, as much as these formal edges are sought after, they tend to generate confusion more often than moral or epistemological clarity. The cliff is not quite knowable as an object in and of itself, because its form is not bounded or self-enclosed. Instead, if we want to seek its explanatory power, we are instantly turned away from it, toward the sea, toward the wind, toward powers and factors that will recede and attenuate and diminish, a concept that presides over the cliff speech, in a seemingly infinite regress. While Edgar's speech is eloquent, the voice which articulates the cliff in the world, the sea, is a murmuring too distant to be heard. And the erosive force of the sea seems even to embattle Edgar's imaginative act by reducing the sounds in his poetry to a single droning vowel, murmuring, surge, unnumbered, as though we are witnessing poetry itself lapse into entropic equilibrium. The cliff, or the imagined picture of a cliff, closely and properly described, seems to dissolve the very language that first sought to constitute it. That the cliff suggests an infinite regress in nature participates in the play's deeper preoccupation with the problem of cause. Here, we would obviously think of Lear's famous statement that nothing will come of nothing. And the play is quick to point out how this metaphysical problem is a moral one too. Or maybe that it's impossible to distinguish between moral and metaphysical reasoning. For in fact, causes in this world are almost always cast as instances of violence and suffering. Even the act of bearing children is understood as a cruel impingement, an act of will imposed on an unwilling subject. How could we expect filial gratitude in such a universe? As Lear himself states, the first time we smell the air, we wail and cry. This inability to isolate an object or experience from the causes that produce it sows general confusion throughout the play. Repeatedly, we find ourselves in a pattern where, by trying to look precisely into the nature of a thing, our vision and our thinking end up drifting inexorably away from it. Does the so described thought-extinguishing storm offer an image of Lear's madness, or a desperately needed distraction from it? Are we looking at his anguish or pointing away from it? It is meaningful that in King Lear, one can even have this uncertainty. And as the example of the storm scene suggests, the problem of isolating and understanding objects and images of the world on their own terms is particularly entangled with the play's investigation of suffering. Edgar makes this explicit when he declares, "The worst is not so long as we can say this is the worst." Edgar seems to be suggesting that the deepest forms of suffering happen beyond or outside of language and representation. Or even that the moment we attempt to identify and create that ultimate boundary in speaking, saying this is the worst, we have inevitably implied something on the other side of it, something more unintelligible to which we can only vaguely point, in much the same way that the image of a cliff implies the existence of a sea. Returning to Aristotle's Poetics, tragedy requires that we think in terms of formal boundaries. But at least in King Lear, suffering doesn't allow for the world to be broken into discrete units. It asserts a too permeable universe, where one thing is always impinging upon, or violating, or sliding into another. Suffering seems to generate a kind of moral and epistemological confusion, whereby the precise nature of the self, and therefore the precise nature of one's moral responsibility, become unclear when subjected to it. Thus, when Edgar catches sight of his tortured and disfigured father for the first time, he cries out, "World, world, O world," a word which, paradoxically, comes close to meaning nothing because it encompasses too much. In the moment of suffering, one is put in contact with the world, Unlike simple bodily pain, it is not psychologically isolating. But at least in Lear, that world is not given in an intelligible way. It intrudes too much and too fully. This may be why suffering is synonymous with madness in the play. When one experiences oneself as exposed to the forces of the world as an undefined whole, there is no sense of how or when that suffering could come to a close. It is not a coincidence, then, that when Lear imagines Goneril enduring the ingratitude of her own future children, he also conjures the image of water wearing away stone. Here, Lear prays that Goneril's face be ruined by her thankless child, such that it would, quote, stamp wrinkles in her brow of youth, with cadent tears fret channels in her cheeks. Goneril's face is described using the language of natural phenomena because suffering seems to imply a world that is similarly open, contiguous, unfathomable, and without proper bounds. And as such, the representation of Goneril's suffering is little more than a mechanical imprint of an oppositional force. A similarly erosive description of suffering is registered in King Lear's language, too. Readers of the play will recall how often the king's speech is reduced to repetitive particles. Kill, 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 kill. Lear, 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 lear. Howl, 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 howl. As though thought and language have been pulverized to atoms past the point of bearing meaning, like those innumerable pebbles littered at the bottom of Dover, where land meets the sea. But if suffering poses such a problem to representation, how can the cliff and Gloucester's fall from it, things which only exist in language, offer a cure for despair? To answer this question, we must attend to how this moral encounter is precisely shaped in speech, and to the peculiar effects Edgar attempts to reproduce in the mind. When Gloucester first asks his disguised son to take him to Dover, he describes the spot saying, "There is a cliff whose high and bending head looks fearfully on the confined deep. Bring me but to the very brim of it." Edgar repeats this dizzying characterization at the close of his speech, saying, "I'll look no more, lest my brain turn, and the deficient sight topple down headlong." What is described in each of these passages is vertigo, a phenomenon which was surprisingly important to Shakespeare's imagination. Thus, in the ghost scene of Hamlet, Horatio will warn the Danish prince not to follow his father's apparition, saying, "What if it tempt you toward the flood, my lord, or to the dreadful summit of the cliff that beetles o'er its base into the sea? Think of it. The very place puts toys of desperation without more motive into every brain that looks so many fathoms to the sea and hears it roar beneath." Shakespeare's description of vertigo highlights that it is not a simple fear of falling, but rather a fear of what toys of desperation or what turning of the brain may occur when confronted with the sheerness of a cliffside. What one fears in the moment of vertigo is not some external accident, a loss of footing, a slick piece of rock, physical hazards that recall the slippery world of meaning that I spoke of earlier. Rather, it's a realization of how little there is to prevent one, either in the world or in the mind, from stepping off its edge. The place certainly occasions this psychological encounter, but the desperation that results is not strictly caused by anything real. As Horatio declares, there's no true motive governing its effects. Rather, the anxiety that vertigo produces comes from, and here I will use the most important word in King Lear, nothing. But unlike Cordelia's famous utterance that begins all this woe, vertigo presents us with a nothing that can speak, or more strictly, with a nothing that one can experience. It is for this reason that Edgar describes the image of the cliff as a deficient sight, deficiency having the connotation of something not merely unfinished, but whose incompleteness is ontologically charged. One feels the presence of that lack. At first thought, it is tempting to see vertigo as yet another instance of madness in a play with too much of that already. But by putting us in contact with this nothing, vertigo opens up a gap in what had previously been a too constant chafing between mind and world. This is a particularly important experience for Gloucester, who has repeatedly betrayed an obsession with cosmic explanations for human affairs. Everything can be accounted for by late eclipses of the sun and moon. That causal mechanism, that endless pointing further and further away, breaks down in this moment of vertigo. Here we at last get some encounter with unaccommodated man as a unit, the mind confronting its own willfulness, its own spontaneity, its own vertiginous possibilities when touched or acted upon by nothing outside of itself. In this way, Shakespeare's vertigo lifts us out of the realm of mishap and into the world of mind. It transforms an accidental universe into a potentially meaningful one, even if that meaning has to be created through volition and reflection, rather than assumed from an orderly cosmos. In so doing, the play restores a kind of intelligibility so important to Aristotle's theory of tragedy. But it's also significantly different, insofar as it offers us a way of conceiving of human activity outside of the models given in the natural world. In an earlier moment, Lear had struggled to understand his tragic suffering in a scientist's terms. His effort to anatomize Reagan displayed a hope that suffering might be understood using the same formal logic that allows us to interpret the physical body, echoing Aristotle's claim that tragedy resembles the body of an animal, zoon, in all its unity. But the effects of the cliff orient us towards moral action in a manner that isn't grounded in the same terms as nature. As Edgar says after rescuing his father from his fall, "Thy life's a miracle," a concept that insists on his separation from nature's determinative causes. And indeed, the encounter ends with the hope that from this time forth, Gloucester will have free and patient thoughts, categories that don't quite come from nature either. As we observe from the sea's formation of a cliffside, nothing in nature is quite free. It is likewise not coincidental that these moments of vertigo in Lear and Hamlet occur in two passages where sons and fathers are considering their shared obligations. Shakespeare perhaps deploys this dizzying, vertiginous language to cast filial duty as an instance of moral choice, which transpires against a backdrop of infinite will, and not as something forced by mere natural law. Or maybe we are encouraged to think of the sheer miracle of love against a potentially empty world that does nothing to guarantee its existence. And as such, this is a love that must be expressed by falling off the edge of England's map, not by drawing lines within it. But what I think Shakespeare is most interested in exploring is how, in moments of suffering, we might make selfhood a subject of experience, rather than the implicit locus of the world's impinging forces. How do you make the self meaningfully and morally present to itself? And how do you do it in such a way that it doesn't borrow its language from the world which precisely opposes it, or from the very same forces which would accost and deform it? How can we respond to suffering and not simply repeat or re-articulate it? Presented with this problem, it is easy to find oneself, like Cordelia, trying to heave a heart into an empty mouth. But while Gloucester will, by the end of this play, die anyway, he will do so by bursting smilingly, something that could surely only take place when the world inside has become larger, fuller, more expansive than the world without. To close, what I think the cliff offers us as a mental image, is a doubled perspective, which makes sense given that a cliff is, phenomenologically speaking, a doubled object itself, a wholly different entity when viewed from the top than from the bottom. On the one hand, the cliff imposes an image of the inexorable forces of nature, offering a reminder, as tragedies dating back to Oedipus have done, that man is not self-caused, not self-enclosed. But it also glimpses an element of human psychology more sublime even than the natural world, and which can only be encountered in moments when the self is risked, discovered, reasserted. The cliff thus represents the meeting place between what is determined and what is wholly free, the uneasy conjunction that tragedy always negotiates and never resolves. And this is not only manifest in the content of tragedy, but in its form too. By yoking the full expansiveness of the imagination to formal and metrical norms, poetry is always engaged in a mediation between spontaneity and restraint, finding, in the external resistance of form, a tool for the extension of thought, for the creation of fresh language. For Shakespeare, tragedy, properly understood, has to address both sides of human experience, expressing simultaneously the shaping eloquence that gets spoken at the extreme verges of the world and something of the roar beneath. Thank you.